Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our virtual viewers on this platform. Today, for the session on paradigm shift from paper brain to plasma brain, I introduce to you all Mr. Sandeep Chhabra, who will be the moderator for this panel discussion. An alumnus of Weinberg Allen School, Missouri, and a postgraduate in chemistry, Mr. Sandeep Chhabra is the principal of Indus International School, Pune. With over 35 years of experience in education, both national and international curriculum, Mr. Chhabra believes that education is not only about teaching the subject, but teaching the child, as true purpose of education is preparation for life. He also believes that competencies like innovation and entrepreneurial mindset help build creative confidence, which is so important in VUCA world. Mrs. Sandeep Chhabra, welcome to this panel, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anju. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to a panel discussion on, like I said, a paradigm shift from a paper brain to a plasma brain. We are all aware that the world has been in a state of constant change, and the speed of change has quickened over the last few decades. And that's in every sphere. However, when you look at education, whether it's school or higher education, one has witnessed many changes as schools, colleges, universities have strived to make, education relevant. However, these changes most of the time were incremental. All this time, one question kept cropping up. Are we providing the right kind of education to the alpha generation? A generation with a differently wired brain, now called the plasma brain, yet they were getting similar, maybe slightly modified education to the previous generation, who had a differently wired brain referred to as the paper brain. It has, taken the disruption of a pandemic for education to be pushed towards the need to undergo transformational change. Today, online education, people are talking about hybrid education. We see asynchronous and synchronous classes, online platforms, various tools, all being integrated as we work towards creating not a substitute to the physical space, but an alternative form of education. I think there are three key areas as we make this transition. One, the challenges and the opportunities of online education, the re-rolling and reskilling that will be required, and the impact it's going to have on all stakeholders. To find answers to these three questions, we have three eminent panelists with us. I'm going to introduce them. We have Dr. John P. Egan, who's a higher education leader in New Zealand and internationally, with a focus on digital learning technologies. He has published extensively in scholarly journals, academic presses, and mainstream media. His expertise is in higher education, e-learning, scholarship of teaching and learning, adult education, sociology, ethnography, and mixed methods. Dr. Egan began his career in 2004 as a lecturer at the University of Sydney in technology-based education. He is currently the Associate Dean of Learning and Teaching and Director of Learning Tech Unit in the Faculty of Medical Health and Sciences at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. Welcome, John.
Thanks
Our
very
next panelist, welcome. Our next panelist is Dr. Patrick Coleman. He is the Academic Program Manager, Faculty of Environment, Society and Design, University Studies and English Language Division, Lincoln University, New Zealand. His roles include monitoring the quality assurance and control across the faculty and division. Dr. Coleman has been involved in online program development, pastoral care, and teaching in various programs. He has worked in the education sector for over 25 years and has previously taught refugees, migrants, and international students across various education sectors. Welcome, Patrick. Our third panelist is Professor Aparna Shankar from Flame University in Pune. Ms. Shankar is a professor in psychology at Flame, like I said, at Flame University. She holds a doctorate degree in health psychology from the University of Leeds. Her doctoral thesis examined psychosocial predictors of maintenance of health behaviors. She also holds an MSc in Applied Science with medical applications from Birkbeck, University of London. Ms. Aparna works on health and well-being in older adults with a particular emphasis on the role of social relationships using data from aging cohorts. Her other research interests include the patterning of health behavior, the role of environment on health, and inequalities and access to care. Thank you, all wonderful people, for being on the panel here today. So let's begin. I'm going to put the first question to Patrick. Patrick, as education moved from physical space to the cloud, what, in your opinion, were the major challenges that educators had to overcome? But most importantly, what are the opportunities that have emerged as they've made this transition?
Okay, so from my experience, certainly one of the biggest challenges is definitely around infrastructure, because as you move from sort of, again, paper-based tests, classrooms where everyone is there physically, to moving into an online environment, what we found is that if you didn't actually have the right technology in order to do this, you had immediate challenges. So this included just simple things, making sure you have computers that actually worked with microphones and video. I mean, it's not just about the staff, but it's actually about the students who you're trying to reach. So we found that, you know, having students, for example, who are on campus now had to move into online, well, you know, they actually had to have that technology. And so that meant, as an institution, again, from my experience, we had to start looking at, okay, doing an audit for all the students, so they had just to check that, you know, they had the right requirements, that the new technology that we're using, the different software through the university platform actually worked. Because for example, we found that even things like Apple computers, which are quite common amongst a lot of students, again, they're quite an expensive product, I think, overpriced, but we won't critique that. They just didn't work for a lot of things. So again, some pretty major challenges actually in terms of getting, you know, the compatibility of what you're trying to use as a learning management system across multiple platforms. So they were some pretty big challenges. Obviously you also had to have the IT help in order to, again, assist both students and staff. So they were the sort of the challenges, but in terms of opportunities, what it actually has meant was students now can actually do so much more. So for example, where before, you know, if you missed, again, in a university environment, you missed a lecture, you couldn't get to things, sometimes things were available, sometimes they weren't. What it meant now is that you had a lot more resources being made available for students to use and access at different times. Staff were sometimes actually easier to contact because, again, before it's always, you know, having office hours. Office hours meant, you know, between, I don't know, say 10 and 11 or something. Whereas now, you know, you've actually got different ways in order to, again, reach students and for them to actually reach you. Certainly time zones were another issue we actually had to deal with, but again, that can come with, again, the use of technology and making sure that things are available. So also some opportunities were upskilling of staff. We actually found that a lot of staff actually took the opportunity to start realising, well, this is the way forward, so let's start having a lot more workshops around how do we engage students better rather than just like talk in front of a camera or just like in front of a lecture, to now moving towards better task-based activities which you can use, again, various software in order to do this. So yeah, I think there's been some great opportunities to reach students we couldn't reach before and also teach in other ways that we didn't before.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I think one of the great opportunities that it has thrown up is that, it has told all of us, everyone, that we actually have a growth mindset. it was not the most difficult thing to migrate from a physical platform to an online platform. Had the pandemic not happened, maybe it would have taken a lot longer, right? So I think the great learning has been that actually human beings are all born with an open mind, and if you are have the right kind of provocation, we'll be able to achieve much that we think that we can. Okay, let's move on to John. John, this is a question to you. Last year, with lockdown, education, like we were talking, has moved to basically what's become known as online learning, but I think it's remote learning. All right. But as education pushes towards real online education, what, John, in your experience, would you like to share your experience and thoughts on the technology, the tools, the re-rolling and the reskilling that would be required for educators, for them to have the competencies and skills to provide a quality online education?
A great question. Thanks very much. The first thing I would say is the difference between what we did last year and what we are aspiring to is what we did last year is with very short notice and with very constrained resourcing and time and unknown levels of skill among students and staff. We had to migrate what we knew would work in a face-to-face environment to something that was proximal in an online environment. So that was why we called it remote learning rather than online learning. One of the challenges we've had since then is that was to some degree more or less successful in most instances, certainly in our Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences. One of the challenges was for our staff, they now thought that that's what e-learning was supposed to look like because that was their experience and it worked better than many of them perhaps thought it would. So a lot of what we've done subsequently within our faculty is working with staff to say, the difference between remote learning and online learning is in online learning, you don't try to merely recreate what you did in your classroom or your lab or your clinical environment. What you do is you think about what you were trying to teach and achieve and assess in the physical environment and what would work in the online and the digital environment to achieve the same aims. And a classic example of that would be lecturing. I think by the end of our first lockdown, both staff and students were simply exhausted from being on Zoom for 7 hours a day. And that's because being in a physical space and listening to people talk and the energy that's required and the focus required to do that is quite different than being on a screen with artificial light glaring into your eyes and feeding into your brain for several hours. So one of the first things we very quickly established was we needed to really reduce the amount of time that people were spending in online synchronous sessions on things like Zoom. The next question, of course, is what happens, where does teaching happen then if it doesn't happen in that environment? And so we've done a series of rapid redesigns where we've taken specific courses in different programs and redesigned those for more flexible and online delivery this year. As a result, those courses really could just roll over the way that they were intended to when we've just re-entered lockdown for the first time in 6 months. The next piece for us is what are the limitations that we've placed upon ourselves based on the exposure that we have had to the various technologies. Whether you have a really broad ecosystem of technologies available to you or whether you have a really constrained one, our tendency as humans is to whatever our first solution is to a problem, to assume that that's the best solution to the problem. So another process that's going on now in the background, and has been for several months, is looking at what we did, trying to quantify the degree at which it was successful, and really try to think really creatively, what would have made it even more successful? And that's kind of where we're at in the journey now.
Okay, John, thank you so much. And I completely agree that unless and until we, come up with innovative pedagogy and integrate it with technology, all right, it's only then real quality online education will be possible. And the other thing I believe is that there is now learning that is happening across all sectors. And when people talk about the hybrid model where you'll have some physical and some online education, I think this is also a preparation for moving towards the hybrid model. So thank you very much. Ms. Aparna, my question to you, and this is being talked about a lot. The one area that everyone's been talking about and discussing is the impact of isolation. As people were stuck at home during the pandemic without much social interaction. So, and obviously it's had an impact on mental health. So, in your opinion, what do educational institutions need to do so as to ensure mental robustness and well-being of their staff and students as we are trying to grapple with different situations? Yes.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that were made before. One of the things that you talked about, this idea of remote learning, and in effect, I think John talked about it in one of our earlier meetings, sort of forced remote learning. So this situation was really, as we talked about many, many times, completely unprecedented. Not something we've seen before, and certainly not what the usual idea of online learning is, where in theory, you could potentially be somewhere learning about calculus. This was certainly not anything like that. Everyone was forced in various kinds of lockdowns, people were isolated from each other, and there was no real sort of ability to get support from your friends maybe, or classmates, in the usual sense where you might have been if it weren't a pandemic. So there were several concerns about people being isolated, not just students, but faculty themselves. And people, the ability of people to actually provide the kind of support that we needed was depleted because of constraints of the pandemic generally. So I think we need to start thinking this is, a different situation, and hopefully once we're out of the pandemic and out of this repeated cycles of lockdowns, we can move on from that. But as we've talked about, there is an increasing interest in moving to a hybrid model. That certainly seems to be the push from sort of educational policies. The Indian government, the UGC, are certainly promoting ideas about moving, sort of allowing or having more content online. So we will need to think about ways in which where face-to-face contact with students will be a lot less. But again, I think going back to the sort of growth mindset conversation that you had a little bit before, we as universities probably need to think about how we talk to students about mental health. It's very different when you can't actually see students. This idea of you can pop into someone, someone can pop into your office and talk about problems that you have. It's that much more difficult when you're online. In a hybrid model, hopefully the contact will be improved, but universities need to do better, schools need to do better in being able to talk to people, talk to students, talk to families about mental health and about things that they need to do to actually maintain good mental health. There need to be, and we need to think about innovative ways in which we can connect, not just connect in terms of Zoom conversation, but it's not just the frequency of contacts. It's sort of saying, if we have 6 hours of classes rather than 3, that means we're contacting more, that's not sufficient. We need to really think about quality of contact. And we also need to think about quality of contact between people and the students and their families, students and their friends, and how we can actually improve that. The other thing that we found is sort of general health and sort of health practices deteriorating, which has had quite a lot of impact on people's mental health. So people have been at home, people have been sedentary for long periods of time, people have been sort of having a lot of screen time. So ways in which we can think about assessing differently, again picking up on something what John and Patrick talked about, rather than sort of moving quite simply to delivering the lecture or having a lecture mode of teaching online. Find ways in which we can help students reduce screen time, whether it's through the teaching, whether it's through different kinds of assessments, which will enable them to be healthier physically, which has an impact on mental health as well. All of these are things that we really need to consider going from this point forward, I think, especially if we're moving to more online teaching.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and even as school educators, and you are of course dealing with older people, but even at school level, there has been a lot of talk about. We've been talking a lot about compaction of syllabus and moving into nano and micro teaching, giving out short modules, and of course also a lot more, as John was saying, a lot more sessions which are asynchronous and own paced and self paced, and so that there is the opportunity for young people to kind of not get overstressed. Okay, so the last year has been one, of course, of multiple experiences and of course learning. All right. I'm now going to request the panelists to share an experience, a case study, a story that stood out for them, and they'll be, it'll be learning for all of us. So, can we start with John this time? Yeah, John.
Oh, okay. Well, a lot of what we do in clinical education is about building competencies, and competencies can include things like knowledges and sorts of ways of procedures and skills and things like that. And one of the main ways we assess those are what are called OSCEs, which are organized short clinical examinations. We do that because it allows students to build a toolkit of skills and knowledges and attributes over time. It allows them to focus on things intensively, and if they're sequenced well and built in a really good, sophisticated manner, students don't just learn what you want them to learn, they also develop confidence in their ability to work in a clinical environment. So OSCEs are important in all of our programs. We had no preparation for doing OSCEs when we went into our first lockdown. And we had to do some calculations about if we were able to bring students back to campus at this date, how much actual clinical in-person teaching could we manage in the balance of the year, particularly for the graduating cohort, because aside from the impacts that it has on the students, we are committed to producing a cohort of health professionals for New Zealand every year. And were we not to succeed in doing that with what class of doctors or nurses or pharmacists or opticians, New Zealand actually suffers from that. So there is an imperative for us to do this, not just in terms of what the student wants to achieve. What was interesting is we were in some programs able to do roughly 70% of what we had thought could only be done online, in person, online in the OSCE space, with some creativity, with some brainstorming, and with a really strong, important conversation with our accrediting bodies, our professional bodies. So do not worry, we did not teach surgery online. We did not teach any sort of invasive procedure that you actually need to be in the physical space, but by identifying those things that we could do a proximal assessment of online, that actually liberated the space that we needed for the limited, constrained face-to-face time we had with the students. And I'm very proud to say, every single one of our graduating cohorts graduated and was registered, which was not something we thought would happen this time last year.
Okay, great, lovely. That's wonderful. Yes, Patrick, let's hear from you. An experience or a story. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to take mine in the area of assessment. So one of the programs I'm involved with is an English language program preparing students for entrance into pre-degree, undergraduate, postgraduate. And of course, prior to the whole COVID thing, these were paper-based tests. So again, the traditional, you're in a room, you've got students, the whole invigilation, all that. Well, the challenge was we had to suddenly get this as an online thing. So that meant, how do you do this? So we went using sort of a quiz-based function in Moodle, which is an open source platform, learning management system. It's actually very, very common across New Zealand and I think other parts of the world. Free is always good. But the actual interface, again, we had to the challenges were which different ways you can do it. So originally it took a long time until we came up with some of our own hacks through trial and error. For example, take, say, a reading test. You've got a text, got a series of questions. So that might seem straightforward, but again, it's a case of, as you do it in an online way, it's again getting the text, you can actually have more opportunities to make sure it works on whether students are using say an iPad or a laptop or a computer. So just all those sort of challenges there, but in the end, what it meant was we actually had a system whereby the test actually, in a sense, looked better now actually, because the interface is so much better. Questions, we found out, again, different ways in which we could actually get the paper-based into the online in a way that was visually easier for a lot of students. They actually found it a lot better. Also, the same happened even with sort of writing assessments. A lot of students really hate handwriting and being able to actually just type it into a computer, something which they're so used to, they just found that so much better and so liberating. So I just found that, even in the areas of assessment, again, these are just some simple examples I had, whereby students felt that they could, again, access it a lot more easily, and actually in a way that, again, that sort of drew them a lot more rather than the kind of traditional style of a paper-based. So yeah, that's my example.
Okay, let's move to Ms. Aparna now. Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit about sort of class participation, class engagement kinds of thing, which is one of the things that I was most worried about. So I personally was teaching a course that was new to me last year, and so I ended up having to develop it in the online mode. I was really quite worried about how this is going to go, and given that we had sort of fairly large numbers in class, actually this being online and being able to reuse the Zoom platform much like this, being able to send sort of students into breakout rooms sort of pretty frequently over the course of the class, which enabled them to speak with each other, enabled them to learn from each other, and then feedback to the class. Actually, I thought ran the class and sort of helped the class run a lot more smoothly than I would have expected. With those kinds of numbers, having sort of lots of group work in a sort of face-to-face situation might have been more challenging. And there is a sort of resistance to, okay, we've done some group work, we're not going back into groups. When you, again, in a sort of physical space multiple times, that does tend to happen, at least in my experience. But it was much more easy when working in the online situation. And students really did appreciate that, because though they weren't they weren't able to see each other, meet each other face to face, they were able to speak with each other, interact with each other, share their experiences, and then feed back to the class in almost every session, which I think really helped with engagement. And going back to what I was talking about, it did help with things like reducing their sense of isolation, talk about challenges in terms of what they were experiencing, difficulties that they were experiencing in the course as well.
Okay. So thank you all of you for sharing those wonderful experiences that you've had. We do have a physical audience present there. Of course, we're all virtual, and this is an example of a hybrid model. If there's anybody in the audience that would like to ask the panelists anything, and then maybe we can also look at the chat box and see how it goes. So anyone from the audience would like to ask any of the panelists anything, I'm sure that they can help them with a mic or something like that.
Any questions? Yes, Mr. Angelo.
Ma'am, standing mic.
We have the standing mic over there, sir.
Any one of you could answer this question, but it's just a thought that I guess every educationist or leader must be having. There's so much that this pandemic has taught us, and there's one thing that we would talk over a cup of tea. Is the virtual world now going to stay even if the pandemic goes? Because there are quite a few parents who want this system of exam on the virtual world and studies on the virtual world to continue. I have heard a few leaders talking that even when they go physical, there are some schools that are contemplating very seriously where one section, if you have 5 divisions of 9 for example, you have 1 division of 9 that will be virtual. Would you share your thoughts? Would you encourage it if you were a leader, or would you say no to such parents?
Okay.
I think Sandeep, sir, you can also
want to take that.
Okay, I'll have a go. Yeah, I think it's kind of like using the old cliche, Pandora's box. It's out. So a lot of people don't want to go back to the same old ways of doing things. I think the pandemic has actually created new opportunities. I think a lot of what we're doing is actually getting better. Obviously there's room for improvement. I think there's huge opportunities for people in terms of teaching other ways. I mean, we've been talking about a hybrid model. I think nobody just wants to just have the same, everything just stuck in a classroom. But at the same time, people still do like the social contact. So I think there still actually has to be a bit of a balance there, because it is a challenge to actually, always do everything virtually, like 100%. But I think just going back to 100% in the classroom isn't going to work either. So I think for a lot of the leaders, look, it's out there. There's been a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of upskilling amongst educators in order to do this. So I think it's here to stay.
So if I just want to add on to and ask maybe Mr. Parna or John to answer, is that, of course, there have been now a lot of programs that have been doing online assessments, okay, and, the IB was able to do the grade 10 exam online, even though the children couldn't come to school, they did an alternative task at home. But, maybe John or Parna can take this question, is that, what are the challenges in ensuring authenticity of the assessment that happens, which is not happening in a college, university, or a school environment, but is happening, at home? So, would anyone of you like to answer this?
I think there are sort of platforms growing that are sort of, remote proctoring. I think technological solutions, and I think that as with a lot of them, there are ways around this as well. One of the things I think which Patrick has spoken about earlier as well, I think one of the things that we as educators will need to do is think about or be more creative in the ways that we actually assess. So maybe the old forms of assessment or the old ways in which we used to assess students are not going to be what we need to continue if we're moving more and more to this kind of hybrid model, if we are going to be assessing students online or using solely online platforms. The other thing that, which is sort of slightly different, but one of the things, my concerns about moving more and more or sort of entirely online, of course the issues of contact, but one thing that's, I think people have been talking about more and more is this issue of access. Technology, who has access to technology, how good is their access, how good is your, the gift that you have basically. So we do end up seeing sort of existing social divisions widen further and further with issues around access. So while it works fine for a lot of people and is really sort of desirable for a lot of people, I think one thing that sort of leaders, people in leadership positions really need to sort of think about is how we actually keep education accessible and sort of equitable as we move from this remote mode.
Yeah, I actually think the more interesting direction of travel has been what have we learned from online learning that we can actually do in our in-person teaching. And one of the challenges we have in the health sciences is we get a lot of students from high school who do very well in secondary science and math courses where by really blasting through a lot of repetitive exercises to both memorize things and to drill oneself into the way of producing certain formulae, you can actually achieve very high grades in that approach. That might sort of work in first year of sciences, but you absolutely will not be able to do that in second years of science subsequently. And if you move into a clinical discipline, that sort of thinking actually is what leads to bad clinical practice. Instead, what we need to do, aside from covering the content of our curricula, is we actually need to change what learning is for these students and get them to become more systemic learners, to students who can learn and perform in an environment that is characterized by ambiguity and complexity. And that transition for students is really, really hard. Some of the things that we had to do online because of COVID actually work really well at doing that. One of the, probably the main thing is by just really eliminating as much lecturing as possible, putting the onus on students to read and engage with content, and then spending our time with the students on interacting between them, other students, myself, and the content we want them to master, and getting to have a learning structure that's based on interactivity rather than memorization. But it's a very difficult transition for students to go through that. At the end of it, they realize actually it's a much more fruitful way of learning, but it's very hard for them.
Continuing from that, Patrick, at your workplace, has there been a lot of effort that's been put to kind of, change the assessments a little bit to make it more suitable to the online or remote learning, as they say?
Absolutely. Actually, because I also work in a faculty as well, what we've seen is actually, you could actually argue the death of the 3-hour exam. The classic university exam, 3 hours of, So what we're seeing is a lot more task-based assessments because there's a realization, well, if you're just going to have some sort of quiz where it's just like, blah, 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 and it's just almost memorized, you're not really learning much. So more applied learning. So again, it might be a take-home test. It could be done over, say, 24 hours. And, the clock starts and you've got to get these things done and you've got all this input. So there's a lot more innovation going on there. So again, the sort of things that you're probably already seeing in a lot of high schools in terms of, again, that sort of task-based learning, task-based assessments. Well, we're now starting to see that within the universities, which unfortunately sometimes are sort of those bastions of sort of old ways of doing things. I'm starting to see the pandemic has actually pushed these things along, so we are seeing a lot more change, and I think for the better.
Sandeep, we have a question
Yes.
from the audience. Should we
Yeah.
pass over the
Yeah.
mic? Yes, please. Ma'am.
Yes, please. Yes, please. I think we're almost out of time, so a couple of questions from the audience.
Good morning, everyone. And I have two questions. The first question is with regard to assessments. And I work as a principal of a school. When we have taken up many online assessments, and we could find answers at practical level, and when descriptive questions are asked, most of the answers are cut copy paste answers from Google. And then even when we have conducted Google form test, we could find there is no reliability of the answers. When they wrote the examination at school, it is better, more reliable than what they have appeared from the home front. So it was very difficult for us to assess the child's capability, because whom we were considering as a bloomer, they were scoring more than 95% of the marks in online classes. So we were not able to assess the children properly. That is one aspect I wish to say. And the second one is when we are handling online classes, and what are the digital tools that you suggest for us to make the classrooms more engaging and enjoying for the children to learn their basic concepts? Thank you so much.
Okay, so she wants, again, I think it's more about the authenticity of the assessment, and the most popular online tools that and platforms that are available today for effective online education. Anyone wants to quickly summarize that? Patrick, could you go quickly on that, please?
Okay, I had a feeling it was going to be me. Okay, so in terms of a platform, I did mention about Moodle, which, as I said, is open source and it's free. So that's handy, and they have got a lot more what we call sort of different types of software quizzes, plugins that are actually getting better again, increasingly so. Authentic assessments, well, you've just got to, again, I think it comes back to the basics. What are you trying to assess here? Because obviously, that whole washback between the teaching and the learning. So the problem is if you've just got content-based where it's just quick memorization, well, maybe you need to look at redesigning how you actually assess things so that it isn't just a copy-paste. Because yeah, I'd agree, it's all on the web, you can just copy-paste. But if you've got applied task-based assessments, well, it actually takes too much time. You don't have the time. You actually need to get on and work it. So you actually have to read things and understand them and apply them. So that actually deals with a lot of those issues. So it does come back to the design of tests. And also, yeah, there are terms of tools to make things engaging. We've found there's actually quite a few out there. I mean, even simple things like Padlet are quite useful. It's almost like you can get a free version. I think you get four for free, or you can actually pay for the pro. But it's almost like a post-it thing. But again, it's a collaborative tool where, again, actually at different ages. Again, it's how you design it. You can actually, teacher can actually look at it, get on it all at once, put people in breakout rooms. You can check all these things. So that's just sort of one of those things. There's actually starting to be a lot better tools out there for both, reading, writing, in terms of being able to not just assess but also teach. So I think, that's increasing. And I see some people putting some things in the chat as well, which is good.
Yes. So like people have started using multiple tools now, for assessments, and they are readily available. And of course, the pandemic has accelerated the growth of availability of these, things like exam.net and assessweb and so on and so forth. And of course, and like you said, also, the teaching tools, to make the classes more interactive and more engaging. Anybody else from the audience has a question?
Actually, I wanted to speak to that one as well, though, if I could.
Okay, please. Yes.
So one of the challenges for us as educators is there is an incredible amount of pressure for us to find the new tool and immediately integrate it into our practice. And there's a problem with that. One of them, we can't. But the other is, sometimes we don't think about the implications for our students of introducing one more thing. And if you've ever had the experience of thinking something was going to work really well and you're surprised with how many students are asking for support and assistance or complaining, it's because even if that thing had good affordances, adding the extra piece of the puzzle just made the whole puzzle fall apart for students. So I actually really encourage people to have a platform for delivery. It may be a learning management system, it might not be. And then try to find a tool that will help you, if you want to build interactivity, find a tool that will do as much as you can in that interactive space and really work within those parameters. And one that I really quite like is called H5P. It allows you to annotate videos, it allows you to build formative quizzes, it allows you to create interactivity, and the cost of it really depends on whether you want your students to have licenses so that you can use it as an assessment platform. But in terms of creating interactivity and content, it's relatively inexpensive for doing that without the student licenses involved. The last thing is, if you need to do some synchronous sessions, Zoom is a good option, but depending on the number of your learners, you might find other tools work for you better. But just pick a relatively small tool set and focus on working with that as extensively as you can rather than adding another one, and adding another, and adding another, because that can often disrupt the coherence of the overall learning experience for the students.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Ms. Anju, is there anything else?
Yes,
from
we
the
have a
audience?
question from the audience, please.
So, actually currently we are in a situation where the government has permitted the reopening of schools, but it is purely on the voluntary basis. So we have almost 80% of the school students who are coming physically to school, but there's still a small, like 20%, who prefer to stay online, and either because of they're remotely placed or they're traveling or the parents are not confident enough to send them to school. Now in this situation, a teacher who's physically present with 80% of the physical students, there are still a small percentage of students who's online. So my question is that how do you effectively engage both online and offline students
At the same
time?
At the same time.
Because it's all, I mean, the teachers are always, and as a teacher I've found it so difficult to continuously run between the Zoom and the physical students to attend them, and often one group is at disadvantage, So how do you bridge that gap? Are there any solutions for that?
Actually, what's happening now is handling both the audiences.
But we're talking of adults and students.
Take this, that we're going to continue to have this kind of a situation.
I wish I could say I had an answer to this. I have to say I don't. And I think this is likely to see something that this is likely to be something that we see over, the next few months, certainly as the sort of, voluntary reopening or voluntary sort of re-entry to schools becomes more likely. I think one of the things is sort of encouraging students who are online to also sort of interact with students who are physically present. So, some amount of the teaching will need to remain online, or some amount of engagement, some amount of, say, assessment, some amount of maybe class participation could be delivered through online means, just to make sure that it isn't a purely kind of disconnected experience for the two different groups. That's the only ways that I think that this might work at this time, rather than having a totally different experience for people who are physically present. I mean, it will in many ways be true, but to sort of draw in, I guess, people who are online to make them again feel part of the class through people who are physically present. So potentially doing things like class activities, class participations that do have a sort of element of being online, so that people who feel drawn in. That's pretty much as far as I've got in terms of thinking of this. I don't know if Patrick and John have sort of different experiences and ideas. But
John, and maybe a last comment from you as well on this.
Can I?
It's hard. That's all I'll say is it's hard. And sometimes all we can do from when we're in the front as the educator is try to if nothing else, set the tone of calmness and centeredness, so the students are better able to navigate the complexities.
We have one last question from the audience, if we could take that, Sandeep.
It's not a question, it's something that I do. She's very right, the lady who spoke. It's a problem when you have both virtual and physical students. So we have 5 divisions in class 9 and 10. Now my worry is class 10 and 12 will be appearing for their board exams. So what we did, we got all the students who are coming physical put into 3 divisions, and the ones who are virtual, all of them in 2 divisions. So we are focused. We know how to deal with those who are virtual, what scope of attention needs to be given to them, and we know how to deal with the other 3 divisions where all the students there are physical, where the teacher's attention is also very focused. She just has to look at the screen, whereas the other teachers has to keep her eye on the classroom. So that's what we are doing.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that input. All right, so since we don't have any more time, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the 3 panelists, Patrick, John, and Chhabra. This rewiring took 4,000 years. The rewiring, the gap between the rewiring and human race will be 4,000 years, and we are trying to answer it in 40 minutes. But we've kind of covered enough ground. I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank IC3 for giving us this opportunity to host this. I hope the audience, whether virtual or physically present there, have benefited from whatever has been said today. So wish you all a lovely day ahead. Good evening to the 2 gentlemen from New Zealand, and good afternoon to everybody else who's present here. So thank you very, very much. Stay well and stay safe.